What unified them was a growing sense that something fundamental was broken at the chapel. The local pastor, Reverend Mitchell from the Methodist Church across town, was approached by several families. They asked him to speak with Reverend Blackstone. He agreed, reluctantly. He later reported that when he arrived at the parsonage, the Reverend was courteous, even warm. He invited him in, offered tea, and calmly explained that his children were undergoing a period of intense spiritual development. It was private family matter. He quoted scripture about respecting a man's household. The morning of October 14, 1977 was unremarkable. The kind of autumn day where nothing seems out of place. Until everything was. 3 children emerged from the woods behind Blackstone Chapel in rural Pennsylvania. Sarah, aged 11. Michael, 9. And little Emma, just 7 years old. They were walking in a line, silent, their clothes torn and soaked despite days of dry weather. Their eyes were fixed forward, unblinking, as though they were sleepwalking. But they were awake. A woman named Margaret Henley, who lived near the tree line, saw them first. She would later tell authorities that something in the way they moved felt wrong, mechanical, hollow. Like marionettes being pulled through an invisible landscape. When she called out to them, none of them responded. They simply kept walking toward the chapel. By the time police arrived, the children were sitting in a perfect triangle on the chapel's front steps. 3 silent witnesses to something nobody could yet articulate. And when they finally spoke, 3 hours later, their accounts would shatter the faith of an entire community. But that wasn't the beginning. 2 years earlier, Reverend Thaddeus Blackstone had been a fixture in Blackstone Hollow for nearly a decade. The town, population 1,800, nestled in the Appalachian foothills, wasn't particularly religious, but it was respectful of authority. And the Reverend was authority. He was a tall man, thin as a rail, with eyes that seemed to catalogue every person he met. His sermons were long and filled with biblical language that the congregation didn't fully understand but seemed important nonetheless. He spoke often about sin, about hidden darkness within families, about the need for spiritual purification. People nodded along because that's what you did in churches. His wife, Dorothy, was a quiet woman who rarely left the parsonage. She'd had a nervous condition for years, or so the Reverend said. Few questioned it. The Blackstone family had 3 children, Sarah, Michael, and Emma. They were homeschooled, kept mostly within the chapel's grounds and the parsonage beyond it. Other children were discouraged from playing with them. The Reverend believed public education was spiritually corrupting. He also believed that outside friendships weakened the family bond. The community accepted this. People in small towns don't usually pry into how others raise their children. But in 1975, something began to change. It started with absences. Sarah stopped showing up to the weekly town gatherings. Michael no longer attended the summer carnival. Emma, who'd once been seen at the general store with her mother, vanished from public life almost entirely. When asked about it, the Reverend explained that the children had become obsessed with spiritual study. They were preparing for something important. Something necessary. No one questioned what. But mothers began to notice other things. Their own children would mention, in passing, that they'd heard screaming from the chapel on certain nights. Strange singing that didn't sound like hymns. The Reverend would explain, when asked directly, that they were engaged in spiritual exercises. Cleansing rituals for the soul. Nothing more. By late 1976, whispers had begun to form a pattern. Teachers from the neighboring county who visited for administrative purposes reported that when they'd seen the Blackstone children, they seemed withdrawn. Almost traumatized. One teacher noted that Sarah flinched at loud noises, her pupils dilating with fear. Another mentioned that Michael had written a composition about being trapped in darkness. It was assigned as a prompt about historical caves. His response was profoundly disturbing, detailed, visceral, soaked in terror. The Reverend explained that children had vivid imaginations. He said this with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. By spring of 1977, parents in Blackstone Hollow were afraid, though they couldn't articulate exactly why. Fear in small towns spreads like mold in dampness. It began with fragments of conversation. A woman named Helen Roberts claimed she'd been driving past the chapel at midnight and heard what sounded like chanting. Another resident, Tom Mackey, said he'd seen the children through a basement window, standing motionless in candlelight. A nurse from the county hospital reported that when Dorothy Blackstone came in for a routine appointment, her arms bore strange bruises, finger marks, and when asked about them, she'd simply pulled her sleeves down and said nothing. The contradictions mounted. Some people swore the children looked starved. Others insisted they seemed perfectly healthy, just quiet. Some claimed the screaming happened weekly. Others said they'd never heard anything unusual at all. The stories fractured, reformed, contradicted themselves, the way rumors do when they are built on fear rather than fact. Reverend Mitchell left feeling inexplicably uncomfortable, unable to articulate why. By September of 1977, the Township Council had decided to look into the situation. They planned a welfare check. They scheduled it for October 15th. They were one day too late. The children were taken to a hospital in the neighboring county. They were separated for questioning. What emerged from their interviews would become the central mystery of Blackstone Hollow, and would remain profoundly unexplained. Sarah, the oldest, was remarkably coherent. She described a place, she called it the Black Room, that existed somewhere beneath the chapel. She said they went there at night. She said the Reverend would teach them about sin. About how their bodies carried darkness. About how the only way to purify themselves was through specific rituals she couldn't fully describe but which she indicated were physically painful. She mentioned candles. Chanting in Latin that the Reverend said came from ancient purification texts. She spoke about kneeling on hard floors for hours. About isolation in darkness. About water so cold it felt like burning. Michael's account was more fragmented. He spoke of confusion, of not understanding the difference between night and day. Of his sister crying. Of the Reverend's voice becoming distorted, almost unrecognizable, as though he were possessed by something else. Michael used the word hollow repeatedly, that the Reverend became hollow, like something was speaking through an empty vessel. Emma, the youngest, could barely articulate her experience. She drew pictures instead. Crude, childish drawings of stick figures beneath ground. Of mouths open in screams. Of eyes that were just black holes in faces. When asked to explain, she would simply shake her head and ask if the Reverend was dead. Psychological evaluations were conducted. The children showed signs of severe trauma. Elevated cortisol levels. Sleep disturbances. Emma had dissociative episodes where she seemed to lose awareness of her surroundings. Sarah exhibited symptoms consistent with extreme anxiety and post-traumatic stress. But no physical evidence of abuse was found. There were no injuries consistent with the children's claims. No signs of systematic beating or starvation. No evidence of the Black Room, despite thorough searches of the chapel and parsonage. The basement contained only old furniture and storage. No candles burned marks on the floor. No Latin texts. Nothing. This is where the story fractured entirely. The county prosecutor, a pragmatic man named Gerald Price, faced an impossible situation. 3 traumatized children with detailed accounts of abuse. No physical evidence whatsoever. A Reverend with no criminal record, a stable family history, and numerous community character references. The Reverend's defense was simple: the children had become confused. They'd spent too much time in homeschooling, too much time isolated. They'd begun to blur fantasy with reality. He suggested, carefully, sympathetically, that they might be experiencing mass psychogenic illness. A shared delusion born from isolation. He acknowledged that his spiritual practices were unconventional. He spoke about meditation, about darkness work, about confronting the shadow self. But he insisted that nothing physical had occurred. Nothing criminal. He was a man of God doing spiritual work. When confronted with specific claims, about the cold water, the chanting, the Black Room, he smiled sadly and said that children's minds are powerful places. They can create elaborate narratives from fragments of experience. From overheard conversations. From imaginative play. He said this with such gentle certainty that even some investigators began to doubt. The community fractured along predictable lines. Some families believed the children absolutely. Others believed the Reverend completely. Most found themselves suspended in an agonizing uncertainty. How could 3 children lie in such terrifying detail? But how could a reverend be guilty of such horrific abuse with no evidence? The question was never resolved legally. Without physical evidence, without a crime scene, without corroboration, charges could never stick. The prosecution lacked sufficient grounds. The case stalled, then died. The reverend remained free. But years later, something emerged that changed everything. In 1984, Dorothy Blackstone died by suicide. She took medication and alcohol in a locked bathroom, leaving no note. Among her possessions, investigators found a journal. In it, written in careful handwriting, were entries dating back to 1973. They were cryptic, fragmented, filled with religious language and personal torment. One entry, dated March 1976, read, "He says the children's souls are infected. That we must burn out the sickness. I can hear them crying from the basement. I cannot stop him. I cannot stop this. The Lord has abandoned this house." Another, from September 1977, just before the children were found, "I have finally understood. There is no black room. There never was. But he made them believe. He made us all believe. And now they believe it so completely that it has become real. The cruelty of a man who can rewrite the world with only words." The final entry, "I am complicit in the destruction of 3 souls. My own is already gone." When authorities returned to the chapel with Dorothy's journal as evidence, they found the reverend had disappeared. He'd left no forwarding address. No explanation. Simply gone. The journal suggested something far more insidious than physical abuse. It suggested psychological manipulation on a profound level. Gaslighting so complete that the children had internalized an experience that may never have physically occurred, but which had left them traumatized regardless. The question became unbearable: had the reverend actually done anything criminal? Or had he simply convinced 3 children that he had? Sarah Blackstone spent 2 years in psychiatric care. She developed severe anxiety and struggled with flashbacks to experiences that may or may not have happened. She eventually moved to another state, changed her name, and attempted to build a life. By most accounts, she never fully recovered. Her relationships were marked by profound distrust. She struggled with authority figures. She died in 2003, officially by accidental overdose, though some who knew her suspected it was intentional. Michael was luckier, in some ways. He threw himself into academic work, became an engineer, built a functional life. But he carried the weight of never knowing what was real. He spent years in therapy trying to untangle genuine memory from implanted belief. He eventually wrote about his experience in a self-published memoir titled The Hollow, which detailed not the events themselves, which he could never fully recall, but the psychological devastation of not knowing what happened to you. Emma struggled the most visibly. She developed severe dissociative identity disorder. She was hospitalized multiple times. Her life became a fragmented attempt to understand which version of her childhood was true. She became obsessed with psychology, particularly the psychology of false memories and trauma. She's still alive, though she rarely leaves her home. Dorothy's suicide was ruled a consequence of her psychological state. The possibility that she'd been complicit in emotional abuse, or that she'd been trapped in a situation she couldn't escape, remained unexamined by most. Few people spoke of her with anything beyond pity. Reverend Thaddeus Blackstone was never found. Some believe he died decades ago, lived out his life under an assumed name in another town, or died by suicide himself, unable to reconcile what he'd done. Others whisper that he's still alive. That he moved to another congregation in another small town. That he may have done this again. The case of the Blackstone children remains one of the most psychologically unsettling episodes in Pennsylvania's criminal history, despite never resulting in conviction. But there remains a question that haunts Blackstone Hollow still. Did Reverend Thaddeus Blackstone abuse 3 children in ways that left no physical mark, leaving only psychological scars that can never be definitively proven? Or did he commit something far more subtle and horrifying, the creation of trauma through pure psychological manipulation? The deliberate destruction of a child's ability to distinguish reality from delusion? And if he did, is there a legal system equipped to prosecute such a crime? The children who were found in 1977 are now in their 60s. They've never given a unified account of what happened. Their memories have fractured differently over the decades. Sarah insisted until her death that the Black Room was real. Michael eventually began to doubt. Emma simply stopped trying to remember. Reverend Blackstone's fate remains unknown. But somewhere in America, there may be other small towns. Other children with fragmented memories they cannot trust. Other families wondering if what they remember is real or implanted. And somewhere, a man, or perhaps multiple men, might continue doing exactly what Reverend Blackstone did. Creating trauma from nothing but words.